All right, and it looks like we're live. Hello, everybody. It's another Thursday, and here we are, Anchore open source gardening session on February, I believe, 19th. Thanks everyone for joining. My name's Dan. We've got Keith and Will on today, and we are part of the Anchore open source engineering team. We get together every week to talk about any and all things Anchore open source tools related. And what we do fundamentally around here is, we've got tools that will be able to inspect your software elements, be they container images, file systems, source code checkouts, and really try to figure out like what's actually in there, what are they made of, and express that analysis in the form of an SBOM. And in our definition, SBOMs are, yes, lists of software dependencies, names and versions, but they also go a lot deeper. You get full file manifests, you get artifact relationships, you get interesting new types of material like AI models in giga format and all sorts of stuff. And then in addition to that, we've got a set of other tools that can essentially take one of those detailed SBOM actionable documents and do something interesting with it in the security and compliance space. We've got Grype, which is a tool that can take an SBOM and do a very high quality and accurate known vulnerability scan. And it's got some interesting advanced features like the ability to score and prioritize vulnerabilities according to their various types of metadata. We've got another tool called Grant that can take an SBOM and do some detailed open source license analysis and apply some lightweight policies and other types of checks against that material. So collectively, our tooling is essentially pointed at your software. We can figure out exactly what it's made of, and where your software is expressed in a variety of forms, and then use that analysis for a number of best practice security and compliance functions. So typically what we do is meet every week and go through the open source projects, Syft, Grant, and Grype primarily, and look at any issues or PRs marked with needs discussion, and we might also have some other interesting topics to discuss as well in these sessions. So I think with that, we'll probably turn it over to the team, see where you guys want to start. We can start with our issues and PRs, or if there's another special topic we want to touch on first, we can go there as well.
Well, I think we were kind of talking about a couple different things, but did you want to start with the dependency graph one? I think it's the last link in our chat here.
Yeah, we could talk about that. There have been some recent comments. I think a fair summary is, so Syft emits dependency relationships for a variety of ecosystems, but it doesn't emit a strictly rooted graph, like a strictly rooted tree of dependencies. It just emits like, well, we found a node project and we know about these dependency relationships in this directory in the file system you pointed Syft at. And we found a Go binary and we know what its dependencies are because that metadata is baked into the binary over at this path, but there's not like a graph rooted at the image itself. And I gather that makes it hard to import Syft output into dependency track. And people have been asking us about an update on that. Keith, is there anything you wanted to add to that? Did I summarize that reasonably well?
I mean, I think that's a reasonable summary of the thing here. One thing you'll see my last comment here, I kind of put together a draft PR that does what they're asking for. And I had a look at, what happens in dependency track, and I tried a couple of other things, but it seemed like the only real way that you could get it to show up in dependency track as like in the form that they're expecting is with the dependencies in CycloneDX, which that PR has. So I think the thing about this particular ask is something that we end up kind of going back to, like with a relative amount of frequency, which is kind of a twofold problem. So one aspect of the problem is our dependencies the right type of relationships for the things that we're looking at? And the other aspect of the problem is, can we express the relationships the right way in Cyclone DX? And the problem that we have with Cyclone DX is that there are, as far as I understand it, basically two types of graph relationships that we can express in the format. One of which is a contains relationship, and you can do that by nesting components in the structure of the Cyclone DX document. And the other of which is using the dependencies, which is a relationship that's specifically called dependencies in Cyclone DX. And with some of the experimentation that I did, um, when looking at this pull request, or when seeing what we could possibly do, dependency track doesn't seem to like the nested contains version of the relationships. The only way that I could seem to get anything to show up with a graph that would make it, that would work with the, I think what people have been asking for, is to use the dependencies and not the nesting. So like that's a very important detail to know, because when we start talking about is it the right thing, I think we kind of come back to, and we can certainly discuss this for sure, but I think we generally come back to no, it's not the right thing. It's not a dependency relationship. It's a contains relationship. And so, or maybe some other type of relationship. And that makes it challenging because we try to be as, exact in our use of the SBOM formats as we can be. And because Cyclone DX is limited to specifically only dependencies with no qualifiers, no comments, no, it's just dependencies. It makes, we like don't tend to think that it's the right thing to do. And so I think kind of where we landed here was that maybe we can add a flag, because a lot of people want this. Dependency track is pretty popular. I'm sure some other tools tend to have the same behavior where they only support, the dependency type relationships. And maybe we can have a flag to sort of shoehorn everything into their in Cyclone DX format if that's what the person opts into. Um, and that's kind of the very long summary of where I think this stands at the moment.
I,
And I think,
it's an
go
interesting
ahead.
challenge, right? And I have a couple of questions. One of them is like, so far we've been talking about this in the context of a container image because that's where this issue started. But let me ask today, if you were to create a Cyclone DX SBOM against a source code checkout, does Syft output the dependencies as dependencies, or do they use the nested? Does it use the nested component structure?
Well, today, we have, I think we might have talked about this last week or the week before, but today, if you scan a source code checkout, specifically you scan a directory.
Right.
And because of that, the root component is the directory and not the
Right.
software component. And because it's not the software component, we don't have the root component have dependencies to the things that we found in there.
Yeah.
So yeah, so that's how things are today. And I think we talked about, you know, probably
Yep.
what a lot of people want would be to, take it one step further. If it seems like there's a single software component, maybe a Git repository, or maybe it's a Maven POM or whatever, maybe have options for that. But yeah, we're kind of on the outside of that today, which is a little bit unfortunate.
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
like the only reason I went there is that seems to resolve that case seems to resolve at least the ambiguity of dependency versus component of, because if we did the thing we were talking about last week, whereas you point Syft at a source code checkout, and we did a little work to make sure like to see if we can detect like this is an application, it's at the root, the things we're finding are actually dependencies, they're not contains. because it's a source code checkout. Then I feel like the Cyclone DX would probably look, it would be formulated in a way where they are dependencies, not components of, and that would work with dependency track. And there's no ambiguity there, right? So that's like one interesting, path that this can go on, but it still leaves open the more specific question of what that you were talking about, which is, okay, now what about containers? Like, is a piece of software inside of a container a dependency of the container? Not really. There is a way to express its proper relationship. It's just the problem is that's not going to work when you import that into dependency graph because or track because it wants things to be called dependencies.
And I think this goes back to a theme we've talked about a lot, which is like, why are you making an SBOM, right? Are you making an SBOM because someone told you you had to? Are you making an SBOM so that you can check it against license compliance? Are you making an SBOM so that you can check every component against disclosed vulnerabilities, like a Grype scan? Are you making an SBOM so you have a graph of what you depend on and why? And like this seems like that last case. And we also have other requests that strikes me as kind of related, which is to respect git ignore. And I think almost what the use case is telling us is that, like, I have a local checkout of a piece of software. Like, I have a directory that represents a single application, and that's what Syft is being asked to scan. And I almost wonder if that should be like a special mode of Syft where we do stuff like inspect get tags and branch names and remotes to try to come up with the name of the software. We respect git ignore. We create a rooted dependency graph for whatever it seems like the main module in this thing is. And that opens a worms. Like, what if it's a monorepo, right? What if it's a single Git repository with like a React front end and a Go back end or something in the same? Then we have the same problem where there's nowhere to root the graph. But it might be possible to make a nicer, like, I think the dependencies are just missing like one component. Like, I think if we scan, like in the special case where like, we scan a node app, there's a package.json at the root, and it's a directory source, and there's a .git at the root. Like, maybe we can just say, like, we can just try to look at the package.json and say, what is the name and version of this thing we've been asked to scan, and put that as a component and root the graph. Maybe even by default in that special case. I don't think there's a good way to like make an SBOM for a more complicated file system and have it be a good SBOM, and also have it be a single rooted dependency graph, because a big VM file system or image file system is just not a single rooted dependency structure. That's not what the artifact is.
Yeah,
right.
And I think that leaves open the question, like in the non-source code case, where we've got some ideas about how to improve that trajectory, but in the directory case or the container case, like how can we accommodate this use case of, I want to use Syft to gather information, and with that information be able to supply it to specifically dependency track and be able to get a vulnerability scan. And like the second question on that one in my mind is like, is this something, I bring this up from time to time, but is this something it would be possible to use the Go templating for, or is it deeper such that the suggestion you put out, Keith, which is to have an optional way to see, for Cyclone, treat component of as dependency instead of component of. Is that the right answer?
Well, I think there are, a couple of different answers here, and what was, Will brought up some good points as well. One of the things that I have a prototype for a slightly different purpose is an SBOM edit command. And the purpose of this SBOM edit command is to be able to target one of the packages and raise that up to the root, just like the what kind of what's being asked for here. Um, there are some challenges there. We don't really have a package as the root today, and so there's all of the prototype is has some things that haven't been agreed on. I'll put it that way. But um, I mean, I definitely see that as a very similar thing. So even if we did a source scan, maybe the way that you get the route that you want is to tell Syft, right? Like another
Yeah.
example is like the mono repo is a really good thing to talk about because we've had a number of people who, let's say you have a Maven mono repo, one of your project is a web app, and that's the thing that you distribute to everybody else. In some sibling directories, you have other libraries. So users have a problem that they can't scan that web app directory because they have things they need to include which are siblings and which would be outside of the scan. So they need to scan the parent directory and then they have a whole bunch of stuff, right? But
Yeah.
really what they want is to say, hey, I want you to take all of this stuff, but give me an SBOM for this one thing that I found in here, right? And so like I see that as being almost the same thing that's being asked for here. The only thing is that
Mhm.
like maybe, if we did, come to an agreement about what the in the Syft world, what the package rooted SBOM looks like, then we could kind of automate that if we found one thing. And
Yeah.
Yeah.
I, I wonder if what we're looking for is like if we just say like let's just call it dash dash rooted at, and it takes a path into the file system we're pointed at, and it's a new flag to Syft. It takes a path into the file system we're pointed at. So in the case of the mono repo or the like, directory with like sibling libraries where the root we're interested in or um is like the web app and not the client libraries, but it still needs to be able to access the client libraries. So then you pass a path to maybe the directory. It would be nice to pass a path to a file, like a package.json or like a Go binary or something. And so, sort of like Docker's entry point, right? Where you're like, I built this file system, but like the thing I meant to build is this executable right here. This is the thing you run when I ask you to run this file system. Um, that's actually an interesting point. I wonder if we could root at, like, if we're scanning an image, if we could inspect Docker metadata and root at the entry point path. Um, I don't know if we could, but and so I'm just trying to talk through, and I'm distracting myself. But like, what if we had a flag where we could tell Syft, like, hey, I want you to make a rooted graph as if this thing is the thing of interest, and it's a path within the file system you pointed Syft at. And then
Yeah.
and then if you have like you have a Debian image with your Node app built in it, you point at the package.json, like /app server package.json or whatever, the thing that's going to be run.
Yeah.
And then Syft sort of guarantees to make a dependency graph rooted it there. And then I guess the question is like, what do we do with, we have like libcpan somewhere in this Debian image. What do
Well,
we do with that? Right. It's not in the dependency graph. Do we drop it on the floor? Do we sort of shoehorn it into the dependency graph? Should that behavior be configurable? I don't know. What do you all think of that about like telling Syft where to route the graph? I think that's the thing you really have to tell Syft. Maybe it can guess in special cases, like a
yeah. I
like a single app with a .git as its sibling on a directory scan. It can be like, well, I'm going to root at that thing because it's the only thing. But I think for any more complicated file system, you have to tell it. What do y'all think about that?
Well, I think we're getting close. I don't want to lose sight of like the 80-20 kind of like specific problem because we're talking about making sure that anything we add here can be expressive enough to cover a lot of cases. But there's the other end of the spectrum as well, which is where this came from. Alpine latest doesn't have an entry point. You know, the root in this case, in order to make an SBOM that you can import over to dependency track, the root should just be Alpine latest. And all of the APKs that are in Alpine latest, which is like 30 of them or whatever, are just called dependencies in order for it to work. So like, there's the super simple case, but I think they're compatible, because if there was a flag that said rooted at, and you could say the source that was supplied, aka Alpine latest, and maybe that's even the default. And the consequence of that is that it, instead of calling the artifacts found components, called it dependencies. I feel like there's a way possibly to make that flag plus the ability to specify rooted at expressive enough to accommodate this case.
Yeah, I think this particular problem that you're talking about is specific to CycloneDX.
Yeah.
Because in SPDX, we can already have graphs that express the correct relationships, and we do. And so
100%.
I think there's like two separate things. You know, the CycloneDX relationships into, like, shoehorn them into dependencies, I think, is one option that's separate from changing the root of the graph. And I think they're both useful, and I think one of them might just inherently solve the problem that a lot of people have if, you know, you're trying to get a scan of your node project from a directory scan or whatever. But I think the thing with what you're saying, Dan, with the container, you know, I think that's really just a CycloneDX flag that says, you know, shoehorn relationships into dependencies, and you know, and then we'll just brush our hands, and people who need that graph, they can opt into it, and we just don't do it by default because we don't think they're the correct relationships to use.
Yeah, and,
right.
And do we forgive me if I forgot this, but do we have the ability to specify options for particular formats? I thought we did, right? So this to me would be a really good candidate for that, because I've been only thinking of it for this discussion for Cyclone, because I know it has this particular problem.
Yeah, we do. Yeah, so we can add just a flag specifically for CycloneDX and pass that through. Flag or other option.
Yeah, I can't think of like a downside to that other than it's a little weird, but dependency tracks are a pretty popular system. So, you know, this is a way to connect, you know, our Syft software analysis tool into a vulnerability scanner that just requires the data to be, you know, supplied in a certain way.
Yeah. And I think, like, I agree they're not really dependencies, but dependency is sort of, aside from component, of which dependency track doesn't do, like, dependencies are sort of the most generic thing, right? I mean, in a sense, like, if I want to scan Alpine latest, the like APK of, I don't know, libxml or whatever's in there. There's not, I don't remember what's in Alpine latest, but like there's an APK that I would need if I wanted to make that image. So it's dependency adjacent. Yeah, so that's not a bad idea. Is this, like, do you think it's worth trying to talk to dependency track and just say, hey, like, you know, nested components are spec compliant CycloneDX. Are you all open to accepting that kind of input? I don't know, but they're not dependencies. Maybe dependency track wants to be, like, I'm just trying to understand, like, how much shoehorning is going on if we're taking, like, the SBOM of a container image and putting it in dependency track. I don't know. I don't know anything about dependency track, so.
Well, I think, I mean, if you look at the changes in my PR, it's pretty small, and it seemed to do the trick for what these people were asking for. Because once you get to the top level packages from the container, like we do have dependencies for the next layer down, right? So like this is really just connecting up the very top of the graph to the things that we already have
Right.
accurate dependency information for.
And maybe what we really mean is we really want to say, like, we want to make like a rooted graph for the dependency graph. And so what we're really just saying is, like, anything that doesn't depend on anything else depends on the source, because the source put it there, right? Whatever file system you gave to Syft decided to pull in this thing. So we have that relationship. So maybe it's almost just like, contains as depends on or something. I don't know. If you want to pull up Keith's PR, I haven't had a chance to look at it. I think it might be linked. Is it that 442 or 4243?
Yeah, it's that one. I added a link in our chat, but yeah, I mean, if you just go and look at so I mean, there's a screenshot of what the result of the PR looks like, and this is really what people are looking for, I'm pretty sure, because without this change, they just see Alpine, and then you can't go and dig in, with the GUI to the graph and see where things are. But yeah, I mean, it's a pretty small change. I think the result of this is that I just need to add a configuration option to the PR, and then we can probably call that one done.
Yeah. That sounds good. It seems like it would unblock a lot of people, and off by default config fields that only affect certain output formats are pretty low risk, because you have to opt into that output format and then opt into turning on that config. So it's not gonna, I don't think it's gonna break anybody who's working today, but it will unbreak people who can't do what they want today. So
Yep.
Yeah, let's do it.
What should do you agree, Dan, or okay? What
I think that makes sense.
Is there another thing we should move on to? I think we had another thing to talk about, maybe, which is a quirk in the Docker 29 upgrade.
Yeah, I don't know. I feel like I don't quite have my head around this yet.
Yeah, I don't.
We saw, I think what we're starting to see. So in the GitHub Actions runners for like Ubuntu that are built like 2026-0209, so like 10 days ago as of this recording, are like have Docker 29 for the first time. And we've seen some like weirdness in CI from it. This issue seems to describe it pretty well. And I wasn't sure, we could try diving into this. It might be a little bit, inconclusive, but.
Well, I'm happy to look at something else too, if you'd rather do that.
Yeah, I want to take a second to remind people that if you're on Grype Schema v5, we're going to turn that off in about 2 weeks. So if you do Grype version and you see like something less than 0.88.0, I think, you're running out of new databases we're going to build for you. Please upgrade. If you can't upgrade, please tell us why. Open an issue. We don't want anybody to be pinned back because we broke something or weren't paying attention. So please tell us why if you can't upgrade. Yeah, and then yeah, I'm happy to dive into this a little more. Maybe so maybe the comment from the last comment there looked like it might be interesting to look at. And I think the reason we're seeing like this issue was sort of silent for months, and then we see a bunch of people referring to it in the past week, I think because everybody's running into the changed behavior on new GitHub Actions default runners.
Yeah.
Is what I think is happening.
So it's a little bit of a PSA, right? Watch out for this. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a little bit of a watch out for this, and I think might end up making small changes to Syft or Stereoscope to account for this. That should all be transparent to users. Yeah, can we see?
Is this
if I can.
Is this the one you wanted to look at, Will? The from platform, or did you want to look at?
No, I just a previous comment, not like.
Oh, yeah, this.
Yeah, I just wanted to take a look at that comment because I think that's someone from the project talking about this.
This one, boy, is that an old one. There's been this condition with Docker, and it's definitely been something we've run into many times where, depending on your order of operations, you can end up with a different set of material that has the same name through the general Docker commands, and I'm pretty sure this is exactly why, right, in our previous experience.
Yeah.
So it's good that this is moving forward, because that source of ambiguity has definitely caused issues. It seems
right.
like the order of operations that you do something in with Docker pull, and maybe you're using digests, or you're not using digests, or you're using tags or whatever, but if you have a fixed set of operations and it doesn't look like they have to be run in a certain order to end up at a certain state, but in Docker it actually did matter what order you ran them in, even though there's no explicit relationship between the commands, where you would end up in a different state, has been problematic in edge cases for sure.
Right, and this is also a case where like Syft and the Docker CLI have like very different goals. Right. When you do like, Docker pull Alpine latest, like you might want to like run that container. And so you want to pull something that's going to work on the host you're on with the fewest layers of adaptation and emulation possible. But Syft is just like, Alpine latest is just the name of a file system that it's going to read. It's not going to execute it. It's just going to sort of index it, figure out what's in there. And so on Syft, it's like, okay, well, I'm on my ARM Mac and I just want, like, I incidentally want to know what's in the, S390X Linux version of this image. That's a perfectly valid request because it's just the name of some files I can download and then examine. But I think there's some ambiguity in Syft too, because like Syft, if you just do Syft Alpine latest and Docker is running, Syft will tell Docker to pull Alpine latest and then basically splat out an OCI directory in temp from the resulting image and then index that. So that means for a multi-image manifest, if people don't specify a platform, if you are on an AMD 64 laptop and I'm on an ARM 64 laptop and we both run Syft Alpine latest at the same time, we're not indexing exactly the same bytes. And like, I think Syft following Docker has said, well, we don't want to make everybody pass -- platform Linux AMD 64 every time they want to do anything. We should instead guess sometimes. And that's sort of what Syft's approach is, to try to make it easy to invoke, right? You can have, if you do Syft alpine latest, if you run in verbose mode or you specify an image that doesn't exist, you can see this great error message where Syft will say like, okay, I tried to pull this image from Docker, but Docker doesn't have an image with that I have permission to pull. I tried to pull an image from Podman, but Podman isn't running. I used the Google Go container registry client and pulled this. There's not a file under PWD called Alpine Latest. Like it tries to figure out what you meant, which I think is a really good feature because it makes it a lot easier to invoke. Sort of the opposite of the CLIs where you have to type like, get plus SSH :/ fully qualified URI to get it to do anything. But yeah, so I don't know. I don't have, like, as I said, this discussion is a little bit inconclusive. It's starting to come up because Docker is working on making this less ambiguous and sort of standardizing around how multi-arch images work and things. And that change is starting to roll out. I'd be interested in that last comment also linked to an issue that might be interesting to take a quick look at. That 50,043, I haven't looked at this at all, but right, so make Docker run prefer. So on a Linux ARM64 host, they pulled that one. See, this is interesting. Like, right, and so yeah, there's this like sleight of hand that I built into the Docker CLI's UX, where it just sort of pretends that a multi-architecture manifest and an image are the same thing, and it refers to them the same way.
Yeah.
And that introduces all these crazy edge cases, but it also keeps you from typing the name of your platform every time you do anything. It's probably a valid trade-off, but yeah. Anyway, Keith or Dan, did that remind you of anything you wanted to bring up?
I'm just still trying to make sure I understand the issue. So it seems like if I try to pull an image and it defaults to the platform that I'm on, and that image exists, like it's a multi-architecture image, and it does have that platform, then everything works today. And the problem is, if it doesn't have that platform, I need to explicitly tell it what other platform to use.
When you say it works today, what you mean?
Like Docker run, or like our problem. I guess, yeah, I'm trying to understand our problem that.
So I think today, if I do like on my Mac, if I do Docker pull Alpine latest, then my local Docker daemon cache has Alpine latest as ARM64. And then I do Syft Alpine latest -- platform Linux AMD 64. Then the Docker pulls will mismatch and Syft will fall back to the container registry client and pull the image with the container registry client. And I think that's a little bit surprising. But as we can see from these issues, it's really not obvious like what the correct behavior should be. Let me make sure that's true. Yeah. I'm going to delete some local images and pull some local images from.
Well, I think this example is pretty emblematic of the ambiguity that I've got up on the screen right now, I think, right? Because like this is how I know of it working, and that tracks because it says before. So we're on an ARM64. We pull AMD64, but then we go to run, and this is the same, the same image tag. we go to run, what Docker does today is it'll try to run what's in the engine, which is the AMD 64, and it won't work because you're on ARM 64. And that's weird in a sense, although it's kind of accurate, right? Because like you pulled something, now you have something locally, it tries to run that thing and it says you can't. Well, you can because it's doing emulation, but you know, you're running the thing that you just pulled. The change, I feel like, is kind of interesting, right? We're still on ARM 64. We pulled an AMD 64, but when we run without a platform flag, it's going to pull the ARM 64 to try to make, you know, to guess at the intention of the user that they just want to run the best image, not run the image they just pulled.
Right. And that's also really like, and that highlights the race condition you were talking about earlier. Like,
That's
what
right.
if I pulled Linux AMD 64 because nobody had pushed the ARM 64 yet for that tag?
Yeah.
And then there's like a time of check, time of use kind of thing going on here. So it's not obvious what the right thing to do is.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I appreciate that, Dan. That helped
Yeah,
me understand.
I feel like this is probably at the core of what might be happening to cause those other, like the flurry. Like now that the GitHub runners have changed to this version, this behavior, if this is the behavior that changed, I could see causing some things not to work because it just like changed the expectations.
Right. And in terms of what Syft might be doing, if we do a pull with a platform and then Docker save, let's say, and there's this platform mismatch, or I can see how that might end up being an issue. Okay, that has helped me, I think, a lot. So
I think we'll just have to watch out for this. It looks like the non-specified behavior of various Docker operations the behavior of various Docker operations when platform is not specified has changed. And so we just have to watch out for those cases, I think.
Yeah. And I think there are cases today where Syft is falling back to the container registry. Like if you specify Syft dash dash from Docker, I think it'll hit an error for some cross-platform stuff. And so it has a registry client in it. Maybe don't pass from Docker this week while we're working on a fix.
Cool.
Yeah, and if you have thoughts about like how you want, because an SBOM is really like you're analyzing it, not running it. So it's a little bit silly to like guess which platform you wanted to run on because you're not going to run the image at all if you're using Syft, or at least not in this step. So yeah, if you have thoughts on how it would be unsurprising for you for Syft to behave, because I think like Syft downloading the platform you're on and scanning that is sort of unsurprising. Syft could also like do an end run around the platform thing and scan because a multi-arch image is sort of like a convention, right? It's a named list of images, and somebody's telling me that this file system and this file system are equivalent on different platforms, but nothing about the world makes that true, right? I mean, there's nothing like it would be weird mislabeling to like compile a different version of the software at the same tag under different architectures or whatever. But yeah, so anyway, stay tuned for a quick update on that. And
yeah, sorry, I was just kind of pulling up some of the more recent ones. This is like just 3 hours ago. This is in the Azure pipelines. Looks like they're reverting to a pre-29.
it's interesting, and so what they're doing is they're pinning back their runner image.
Yep. So
Yeah,
there's
and
there's some churn, right? There's some
yeah.
there's some churn in the behavior of Docker as unspecified as we talked about. It also looks like there's some churn in the like what are you generating a multi-list manifest by default, or which looks like that was a big change as well. When you do a push, even if you just have a single platform, you're getting a multi architecture manifest with just one architecture in it. That's a big change, right? Because that changes fundamentally the thing that is fetched when you ask for information about an image from a registry. So
Right.
it looks like there's a number of things that are kind of contributing to it. They're all good changes, but they are changes, and so we'll just have to weather it and keep an eye out for it.
Well, I'm glad we dug into that. Like I said, it was a big help for me.
Nice.
Should we look for? We still got some time. Should we look for something else?
We could.
Yeah, let's. Yeah. Sorry. Go ahead, Will.
I was going to say, I think. Are these? I'm worried these are stale needs discussions.
Yeah,
we could also give like a little preview and request for comment on Grype 3245, which is attempting, like, talking about what the next Grype DB schema might look like. There's a link in the chat too. Yeah. So I think this is so right now the way Grype works is when you do a Grype scan, like if I do Grype Alpine latest, we're not trying to pick on Alpine latest. It's just easy to remember and easy to type, and it's a small image. So when I'm like making sure Grype works at all, I type Grype Alpine latest. Doesn't always find anything because they're pretty up to date. But so what happens is Grype basically in parallel says, I'm going to get an SBOM for the thing I have, and I'm going to get a new database if I need one. And so Grype will reach out, and we have like a latest.json in the cloud, and Grype will say like, okay, what's your latest database? Is that the one I'm running? If not, download that one. And what that means is if you run like Grype Alpine latest, you download today like 104 megabytes of very, very compressed SQLite database, and then index it and decompress it and then index it. It ends up being about 1,300 megabytes over in your cache directory. And it's got all kinds of stuff in it, right? You asked me to scan Alpine latest, but there's like 3 major versions of SUSE Linux in that database. There's like every version of Debian going back as far as we can in that database. There's like, and so I think that is starting, like we ran into this maybe a year ago. We started having real CDN problems. Like the database was getting close to 200 megs, and the number of disclosed vulnerabilities in the world is monotonically increasing, right? So the database is always growing. We always have to be planning for that. But like a year ago, we were hitting 200 meg databases, and there were lots of issues of like, hey, I can't download that. And we improved hosting as a short-term fix, and then as a longer-term fix, we moved to a more aggressive compression. We moved to a more compressible schema. And moved to Z standard compression, and that got us back under 100 megs. But we're now back north of 100 megs on the download. So it would be really nice to sort of only download what you need. Like if you spending time downloading vulnerability data for a distro that's not present in the material you scanned would be a nice performance win. But right. It'll be a little bit of work to get there. Anyway, Go ahead.
And just to add a little bit of color is that, I mean, part of the reason is that we're adding new data sources, right? We've added Kev, the known exploited vulnerability list. We've added some other things, new providers. And so, I mean, it's not just the vulnerabilities are increasing, but, we're increasing coverage along
Right.
the way too.
Yeah. I mean, like one example, we added Fedora support. We actually turned that up. That's new as of today or yesterday. Grype can scan Fedora images and find vulnerabilities in them as reported in the Fedora update system. So right. So there's like a two effect. There's like the double effect of the images getting bigger. One, there just keep being more vulnerabilities and more software, and the old vulnerabilities don't stop existing. I mean, maybe the software they affect stops being common, but the vulnerabilities still exist and still affects whatever weird version it affects. And then we're adding new providers, and then the new vulnerability providers, their data is constantly expanding. So this might be the next step in staying ahead of the scale of the data.
Yep. Especially crossed with this idea of there's a viable and interesting way of accommodating for this new structure. Like rather than having a single database, having multiple databases, but with the ability to use the SQLite attach functionality, which is pretty interesting. Like this is an interesting document to read through that Alex put together.
Yeah, this is pretty interesting, but I mean, I think, fundamentally we're talking about, identifying that we have certain packages with certain providers and only partially downloading the data that you need. So in theory, if you're just scanning a Red Hat image, then maybe you just get Red Hat and NVD, or maybe just Red Hat. So that's a win for everybody, because you don't have to download all of the SUSE data or whatever else.
Right, but it's also Go ahead.
And honestly, I don't know if it might be apparent to folks in the community, but behind the scenes here, at least from my perspective, this one is a huge win operationally, because not all of the vulnerability sources have the same characteristics that require the data to be modified. But by having a single database, effectively you have to build a new database if anything, and any provider has an update anywhere on any cadence.
Right.
And like this, I think is actually a really cool one in terms of like the overall efficiency of this situation, ranging from what you have to download, even if you're downloading everything, all the way up to, how fast we can build new things and what to do in partial failure cases. This, like the ability to add this characteristic to the end-to-end story, I think unlocks a lot of patterns that we can't really explore at the moment with a single data source.
Right. For some data sources where they rarely publish a giant pile of data, we could even have something event driven, right? Where it's just like, okay, we have, the digest of the, tar GZ of all EPSS ranks only changes once a day. And so we just, we don't do anything about it unless it changed. That sort of stuff could be really helpful, because it's getting operationally complicated to build the database. I've done a bunch of work, and the team has done a bunch of work to stay ahead of it, like building the database on more performant instances, identifying which vulnerability sources are incremental, that is, which ones do less work if you run them more frequently, and running those more frequently to try to keep stuff within error and timeout windows and keep the amount of, makes fewer network requests. It's less likely to crash and burn during the run. But again, we can't, the data keeps growing, and it'd be really nice to be able to do independent release cadence. We lose one little bit of concurrency in Grype, which is right now, Grype sort of comes up with the SBOM and downloads the database completely in parallel, because these processes don't know about each other at all. Like any Grype scan needs a current Grype database. And so right now, if you have a large image, you might unpack the database before you're done pulling the image, and you don't notice any wall clock delay from having the large database. on some images. And there's a little bit of complexity here because we have to get far enough into the image scan to have some notion of what data is needed before we kick off the download. But
I wouldn't say necessarily. I mean, we could go that way, but even in the case where we're just downloading all of the DBs every time, no matter what, there's still benefit to having them being independent. Because imagine, like, you know, the Kev one, you already have it from like this morning, right? And when you go ask, like, I need the latest version of all the DBs, what you get back is there isn't a newer version of the Kev one. There's only a new version of the Fedora one. So all you got to do is download the Fedora one.
Right, that makes sense.
So even if you're trying to keep a consistent set, I think having them being independent has a lot of patterns that we can leverage to make everything more efficient. Yeah,
that makes sense too. Well, and also like the use case of on the internet that CDNs and network cards and stuff are built for now is browsing the internet, which is transferring many independent small files at the same time as quickly as possible, which is sort of the opposite of here is a 100 meg tarball with all the answers to all your questions that is as compressed as can possibly be. So that's a good point. Even if we decide to download everything, then we like being able to download even just the end parallel streams, even if everything's stale because you haven't run Grype in a week and there's new data in all the providers and you're only going to need one of the providers, like downloading, you get parallelism n instead of one for the.
That's this one.
I would really love to have some kind of ballpark idea of how many people run Grype without a database and how many people have a leftover database from a previous run, right? Like if we're running CI, for example, chances are you're running fresh and downloading everything new. I don't think we ever came to any kind of conclusion that we really understood what the use cases were.
Yeah, I know, like, one of the things I used to try to do if I was working a lot in a coffee shop is I would try to run GrypeDB update before I left because it's like meaningfully easier to do on like non-coffee shop grade Wi-Fi.
But before you get on the airplane, just do a quick GrypeDB update.
Yeah. Well, then you have to have all the artifacts locally and everything. But yeah, I do. And we did a lot of work to make the hosting better and the compression better and stuff. But we do periodically get like, guys, this is a really big file. It takes forever to download. It's junking up my pipelines. It's junking up my temperature. Like, we get sort of size of data concern issues pretty often. And so yeah, this would be a nice one. And maybe as a follow-on, like I think we get a lot of the benefits just from splitting it up. As a follow-on, we can selectively download only the ones that are where both it's stale and it's relevant to this scan. That might be kind of cool.
Yeah, I mean, this unlocks that as a possibility,
right?
For sure. Yeah, this is a very interesting one. So if folks are watching, like, we'd love some commentary on that. And I think Alex kind of summarized the intention of the document pretty well in the sentence I've highlighted here, which is it's not a design, it's the start of a conversation about viability, trade-offs, and that last part, whether the benefits justify the complexity, right? So I mean, that's the interesting, I think that's a really good way to put the perspective when reading through this. But we would love for people's impressions and experiences with downloading GrypeDB. To Keith's point, your use cases. Are you starting fresh every time? Do you have the ability to maintain a GrypeDB and only do an update? That kind of stuff would be very interesting feedback in this topic. Very, very cool. Like interesting. This will be a nice move, and it seems like an exciting set of stuff we could build on top of it. So
Yeah, we're
nice.
getting close to the hour, but one other thing I would just note is that I have a very strong desire to parallelize a lot more of the things that Syft's doing. And so one of those things would end up being streaming results. So like kind of going back to one of the things Will said is like we could actually potentially start, getting results scanned and figure out what things to download, while the Syft scan is going on at, in some future state.
Right.
That's a ways
Awesome.
off.
That's awesome. All right, we are at the hour. Thank you guys, and thank you everybody for joining us as always. Or if you're watching this later, thanks for taking a look. You can find us on github.com/Anchore, and we will see you online until next week. Have a great week, everyone.
Take care.
Hey, take care all.
Thanks.